This is so much bigger than Trump being his typical petty self and bringing his nails out. Not only is this what dictators do, this is what dictators who are dumb, narcissistic, and generationally bad at governing do when they're about to drive the economy off of a cliff. So, I did some digging to figure out just how bad is the job market and unemployment in the US. I found not only what Trump was hiding, but what many presidents have been hiding. Where are the jobs? The unemployment rate is both extremely important and also devoid of any useful meaning when you see it in headlines. That's very odd. And through time, it has been manipulated to make the economy look much, much better than it is. There are a handful of reasons why anyone would want to know what the unemployment rate is. 1, to get a pulse check on the economy. 2, to strategize on how they should position themselves in the labor market. Will I be able to get a job in that city next month? Will I have to go long distance with my partner? Do I quit next week? Do I smile at my boss a little more this quarter because I can't leave my job, etc., etc. That's maybe what we're thinking on a micro and individual level, but we also think more abstractly at times on a macro level. We might ask questions like, which decades or periods was it more favorable for people to work? Why? What changed? What didn't change? And how did boomers get so... The unemployment rate can be a useful statistic in helping workers game plan their lives in the job markets. In reality, this isn't really how any of us typically internalize the unemployment rate. It could be useful to us in this big picture, life, career, strategizing sense, but normal people have other, much better statistical indicators of how to game plan their lives. Prices, costs, budgeting, as well as work sentiment from friends, family, strangers. These are more immediate and tangible, conscious and subconscious statistical indicators of how we should game plan our work lives. Not to mention the arts themselves, from YouTube, TikTok, films, shows, music, fine art, literature. That is, when the arts aren't divorced from reality. But when does Hollywood ever divorce from reality, you know? So, if the unemployment rate is a kind of second-class level data point and the usefulness for normal folks, why do we hear of it so often? It's because its utility is not meant for you. It's meant for those that speak to the paper gods, those humble intermediaries of divinity, finance men, and econ boys. The metric is also for whom these magicians serve, institutions, whether that be governments, companies, or NGOs. The unemployment rate helps said coin shamans know how businesses and institutions are doing broadly. It's used by them as a proxy for the economic health of capital and as a tool to help them build safety nets for those that are not able to directly serve capital at any given moment so that they may return to serving capital in the near future. Once again, while sometimes it helps econ folks get a feel for public sentiment, this is unfortunately less often truly the focus, as that is better satisfied through other metrics like purchasing power, consumer price index, and all those other sentiment measures I listed before. Okay, well, jargon amongst technocrats is nothing new, so why is this of interest now? The unemployment rate is a special statistic because though it doesn't provide that much utility to you or I, normal people, it does provide value in the social programming of normal people. It can influence how workers view their own power or lack thereof. This can get complex and heady, so give me some time to make it all make sense. We've picked at the surface of why. Now let's get to the what. Intuitively, you might think the unemployment rate should be straightforward. It's just who's in work, who's not in work. Well, we do have that, sort of, not really. Anyway, it's called the labor force participation rate. LFPR is big bro to the unemployment rate. It calculates the labor force divided by civilian non-institutional population times 100. In that equation, the labor force means employed plus unemployed people age 16 and older. But there's an additional modifier on top of that, and modifiers you'll see soon are the bane of these metrics and their usefulness. Modifier on top of that, for those people age 16 and over working, including part-time, or not working but actively looking for work and available for work. The civilian non-institutional population is everyone 16 and older living in the US who is not on active military duty and not in institutions, which is a catch-all term for prisons, nursing home, psychiatric facilities. Spoiler, that's actually a lot of people not included, so I'm going to account for that in a second. Okay, let's actually look at the graph for a second. I'm only really going to do this once because there's more graphs coming that are closely related, but this is going to help me lay the seed for my final explanation later. Okay, looking at this x-axis, we got the time starting in 1950 up until today-ish. And you can see on the y-axis, it's zoomed in to the mid percentiles from 58% to 68% for specificity to make these variances more obvious and dramatic. Okay, so in the 50s, coming out of the war, the government's handing out a bunch of free money and free houses essentially to white people through the GI Bill, the FHA, etc. And people are hitting the workforce, especially from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. We see a large expansion as women enter the workforce, which is a pro in some ways, but also implies that more and more things are getting more expensive and that we need two incomes to support a full household. But ultimately, we see this surge steadily get larger and larger up until 66, 67%, and then it kind of plateaus in the 90s, and then the dot-com bubble crashes. And since the dot-com bubble, we have not seen the same level of labor force participation since. Especially after the 2008 financial recession, we see a precipitous decline in labor force participation, and that we really have not recovered from. And then, of course, a quick spike down from COVID, and then a bounce back to the plateau of the mid-teens. Now, I really suggest, if this is fascinating to you, you should really watch this video and this video from Johnny Harris, where he goes through these decades and kind of compares economic lives from, say, our grandparents to our parents, Gen X, Boomers, Millennial, Gen Z, as well as this video by Aight also. Yeah, big Aight over here. So this measurement actually doesn't solve our problem. What's our problem again? We want to find a meaningful metric for unemployment to understand what's being hidden in the data. Now, solving this problem is of course of some use, but what is really valuable here is understanding the discourse around these metrics and how they influence us, as it's a window into the games being played. Okay, what if we want a broader, more inclusive metric to help us understand unemployment, something that tracks labor force participation but doesn't disregard those not actively looking for work or available to work or those other groups? EPOP, the employment to population ratio, is useful because it includes everyone above 16, regardless of job seeking status. It answers what share of the total eligible population is actually working. It is less distorted by swings in labor force or modifying definitions. Now, if we look at these graphs together, EPOP and LFPR, we see that EPOP is much more volatile. It's swinging a lot more from its highs and lows. And also, if we look at the y-axis, we can see we're going from talking about a scale that's zoomed in from 58 to 68% to a scale that's zoomed in from 50 to 65%. So there's already a drop, obviously, the more inclusive we get with our metrics. Now, overall, of course, the shape and movements of the data are similar. So there's our answer, right? Nah, look at that watch time left. We haven't begun the suffering. This isn't everyone in the denominator. It doesn't include active duty military, prisoners, nursing homes, psychiatric hospitals. Let's take prison labor by itself. If we account for that, that misses hundreds of thousands of people that could be in the numerator, and it misses nearly 2 million people in the denominator of the supposedly all-encompassing metric. I wouldn't be so frustrated with this metric if, like its predecessors in this video, it didn't assume an error of totality that ultimately it does not deliver on. This blind spot makes economic disparities appear softened. For example, Black and Latino male labor force participation and unemployment rates look better than they would if incarcerated individuals were included. Here's some literature on that if you're interested. At this point, you might be tired. Where is the number for that simple question, what share of people are working and who aren't? Well, here we run into it. There is no number. Not only are the metrics economists and sociologists use always necessarily approximations because of their logistical and resource constraints, there's an endless game of who counts, when do they count, who should have jobs, what jobs should you be able to survive on. It may not seem like it, but these are all baked in implicit questions that are asked and answered when the measure of unemployment enters any discourse. Don't believe me? Let's see how we got here. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, mass joblessness, there was no direct monthly count of the unemployed that existed. This implies that it was never a problem in modern times for people to find work. Maybe a philosophical leap, but I'd say that also implies there was not as many things to do as there used to be. More on that in a bit. Okay, so to combat this lack of data, states, municipalities, and the National Bureau of Economic Research each devised their own surveys and indirect proxies, yielding wildly divergent estimates. Our centerpiece of data would come in the 1940s. The Works Progress Administration published the first monthly report of unemployment based on 60,000 household sample, creating the first direct gauge of joblessness across the entire US. In 46, the Congress codified maximum employment as a national policy goal, formalizing in econ speak the latent cultural values of productivity that I'll argue later comes from our Puritan roots. The survey was then rechristened to Current Population Survey, so CPS is what you'll hear today, to reflect its broadened demographic and new economic questions. From the rest of the 50s and 60s and up until 1975, there were a string of death patches to the strat of data collection and data analyses. Please don't fall asleep. I know data governance is not a hot topic, but trust me, clean, good data is not something we should take for granted, evidently. So from 76 to 93 was further sophistication into subsets of the data. Remember, you can't just read the data. You gotta talk to the data, caress the data, feed the data. You know what I'm saying? These alt rates, U1 through U7, were to capture groups of interest like long-term unemployed people, or those seeking full-time work but stuck in part-time. In the late 70s and 80s, the glorious Reagan era, analysts debated whether the headline U3 masked the plight of discouraged workers and underemployed part-timers. The recession peaks, 10.8% in 1982, fueled calls for even broader metrics. This is where the shadiness gets shadier. In 1994, there was an overhaul of the CPS. Only those who had actively searched for work in the past 4 weeks were considered unemployed. Those who wanted a job but hadn't recently searched were now not in the labor force. This made it easier for governments to claim labor market success while sidelining systemic unemployment and underemployment. The CPS touted greater accuracy and cleaner classifications, but for critics like myself, the technocratic redefinitions distance policy from the lived realities of the labor market, especially for marginalized communities. It gave statistical authority to a narrow concept of work, formal, waged, full-time, and aggressively sought, while ignoring informal, precarious, or care-based labor, reinforcing the idea that joblessness was increasingly a matter of individual failure or detachment, not structural disinvestment. This is easily seen in cities in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, where all the jobs, the manufacturing jobs, which used to be the main employer, were shipped away. That hollowed out many cities, including the city that I was born in and still live to today, St. Louis, as well as many other middle American cities. In a very direct way, this hollowing out of the middle, in both the geographic sense and the economic sense, led to Trump being put in office in 2016 and in 2024. As both nationally and across the West, voting blocs are ping-ponging from one party to the other party, searching for populist policies to undo the neoliberalism of Reagan and Thatcher from the 1980s onward. This also explains why the Democrats are polling so much lower than even Trump, who's polling horrendously. Because Trump, for all his flaws, is a populist, albeit a right-wing populist, whose solutions are always going to focus on nativism and a chosen group of people to redistribute all the resources to, while pushing out others. The Democratic Party refuses every left-wing populist that comes to its table that becomes popular. Zohran Mamdani, Bernie Sanders, etc. After this revision that you could really look at as a type of narrative warfare, the government could claim lower unemployment, rising participation, and efficient labor markets, all while offshoring jobs, eroding unions, cutting public employment, and privatizing social safety nets. The CPS redesign helps sanitize the social costs of deregulated capitalism.
If you don't speak economics, you cannot participate in any debate, yeah? Especially because in the last few decades of neoliberalism, we have been encouraged and sometimes even forced to think everything in economic terms. Yeah? So when you're trying to protect a library or a museum, you have to make this economic argument. You know, this will, I don't know, encourage learning and increase people's intelligence and our productivity. You know, why should you do that? Yeah? Unfortunately, that you have to. So increasingly, being able to speak economics is important. But then, of course, that they are not going to let you speak it. Yeah? In the exact same way that the Vatican banned the translation of the Bible into local languages in the medieval times. Yeah? So unless you belong to this priesthood of people who were trained in Latin, yeah? Or unless you were from extremely privileged background and had a personal tutor to teach you Latin, you cannot even read the Bible. Yeah? Yeah, and once that you create this body of knowledge which is not accessible to other people, then you can just kind of, well, basically bully other people into accepting your argument because other people cannot really understand you. Now,
if unemployment wasn't as stigmatized and wasn't a gauntlet of bureaucratic annoyances to acquire benefits from, many more would use them. And as true with all bureaucracy, size snowballs. The Pentagon knows as well as anybody, you use your funds or you lose them. This is part of the motivated rationale and the government modifying how we measure unemployment to make it seem much smaller than it is, so that we as workers view unemployment as an uncommon phenomenon and one where we shouldn't be demanding of benefits and a safety net to put in place for a common issue. Let's get back to these graphs for a second. I want to ask an obvious question. Why do they begin here? If the federal government could report unemployment falling under the New Deal, it could claim credit for recovery and further justify its expansion and more power to the executive. But who is it having to justify anything to? Voters? Workers? A feudal king just a few centuries before this, stay with me, the history matters here, barely needed to justify anything to any of their working populace. But amidst the second wave of industrialization in the 1800s and early 1900s, all those former farming peasants were shoved into cities and suddenly had both a lot more brutal exploitation, but also a lot more visibility into each other's struggles. Unions, collective bargaining emerged amongst workers. On top of this, class solidarity strengthened as the differences began to grow more stark as the ultra-wealthy pull away. And those ultra-wealthy were suddenly not the non-productive parasite of monarchic rule from yesteryears. They became the more industrious, clever, and productive parasites, capitalists. These former aristocrats, or dudes generally with an abundance of intellect, greed, complete moral decay, or some mixture of those three, used their money that they were born into, or someone else's money, whom was born into it, to get a bunch of farmers to work in their new fancy factories, and then got those same workers generations later to eventually manage other workers, we call their services, in frontier lands, places lower on the value-added chain, colonies, or if you're American, territories, as we call them. Why does all this matter to you right now? Since at least the Great Depression, we've been hearing warnings that automation was or was about to be throwing millions and millions of people out of work. Keynes at the time coined the term technological unemployment, and many assumed the mass unemployment of the 1930s was just a sign of things to come. It was. We just haven't admitted this to ourselves. Automation did, in fact, lead to mass unemployment. Services, that management on top of manufacturing and systems maintenance, was always going to be a smaller jobs provider than building things. Think of this in home economic terms. It will always take more people to do the dishes, clean, maintain the yard, etc., than it takes to tell those people to do so, and maybe occasionally come up with an insight that helps them do that a little bit better. A lot more, like probably 10 to 1. As a society, we've replaced those cleaners and everything with appliances, then added dummy jobs to those cleaners to now manage the dishwasher. Why? Why is it this way? Why would we do this to ourselves? If the goal of factories and machines and AI and thinking machines is to do all the work, why have we given ourselves more work at every step? Author David Graeber of BS Jobs and myself would say, it's because there is a deeply held popular feeling that paid employment alone can make one a full moral person, as well as the fact that a stunted imagination of populations long raised in hierarchical institutions often do the thinking for us, from academia, the labor force, even the church, if you think about it. And lastly, a fear on the part of the upper classes, already noted by George Orwell in 1933, of what the laboring masses might get up to if they had too much leisure on their hands, has ensured that whatever the underlying reality, when it comes to official unemployment figures in wealthy countries, the needle should never jump too far from the range of 3 to 8%. But if one eliminates BS jobs from the picture and the real jobs that only exist to support those, one could say that the catastrophe predicted in the 1930s really did happen. Upward of 50 to 60% of the population has in fact been thrown out of work. In the age of AI and robotics, who knows, 80, 90% of people could be thrown out of work, and maybe anywhere from 5 to 10 years. Why does hearing this sound so depressing? If anything, it should sound like heaven on earth. Gramsci spoke about how ordinary people can learn to internalize the values of the ruling elite and begin to perpetuate their goals and their desires instead of their own. In dressed up academic terms, this is called identifying with your oppressor. Now, because providing for ourselves is tied to our employment, it stops us from feeling happy and hopeful that automation and machines have replaced most of the work that we actually need to do. Even though the economic pie has grown, since it isn't being shared and redistributed, none of us are feeling that, meaning that we see replacement as an invitation to suffering and irrelevance, instead of the liberating and thriving future that it easily could be. What this means is that our challenge isn't just to fight for policies that guarantee better pay, to fix the wage to productivity gap, but it's also one of imagination. We need to begin to really reflect on what we actually want to do with our lives and where to find purpose beyond just work. What does it mean when our basic needs are met and we get to choose what we want to do every day with our lives for a sustained amount of time? What does it mean when AI could feasibly do anything both creative or constructive? Where do we draw our pride from in a world like that? What does it mean to trust the collective psyche? What does it mean when we derive less of our status from work? Who are you? Stripped from your job title, your income. And do you still like that person in the mirror? And if not, what can we do to change that? I talk a lot with my friends about UBI and the post-work society approaching us, and I'm genuinely disappointed sometimes in our collective lack of faith in ourselves to find purpose in life that isn't spoon-fed to us. Obviously, right now, we all just need the economic pie to be shared and for the ultra-wealthy to pay their fair share, but very close approaching us, if it hasn't already approached us, are these questions of purpose and imagination that we have to face sooner or later. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.